Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
I think some of them said, and I think they felt they were being generous actually, is that, well, first we have to solve the problem of consciousness, then we can deal with the paranormal. And I stood up and said, no, I think you guys have it backwards. First you have to recognize the paranormal and deal with the data, then you can begin to address the problem of consciousness. And I wonder how you feel about that.
I agree completely, because if parapsychology is true, and I believe it is true, and in fact I think the evidence from parapsychology is probably more rigorous in terms of statistical analysis because of all the grief you guys get from the mainstreamers who don't want to believe it, that tells you something very important, that consciousness is non-local. And if it's non-local, it almost has to be a quantum effect. I mean, electromagnetic waves only go so far. I think it has to be quantum entanglement, which gives you non-locality in space and in time, even backward time effects. And backward time effects are an extremely important clue, I think, to this whole puzzle of conscious experiences. The experiments of Ben Libet, for example, who was at the first conference and who Roger had quoted in his book due to his backward time effects. And so they got to meet.
Now, we better let our viewers know what those experiments are, because they're very important.
Yes. Benjamin Libet was a neurophysiologist at University of California, San Francisco. And in the late 1970s, he did experiments with Bertram Feinstein, a neurosurgeon. And for example, he would have a patient, Feinstein did some cases awake neurosurgery. So you can numb up the skin, the scalp, and the galea, the lining over the bone, and the meninges, and actually operate on the brain while the patient's awake. And Libet came to the operating room and did experiments. For example, if you had the brain area for the little finger, you could stimulate the finger and record from here and ask the patient, when do you feel it? And he had a very sophisticated way of deciding when, because by the time you utter the words, I feel it, that's a long time. So he had a clever way to do that. And you might think that if you stimulated the brain directly, you'd get an immediate response. Oh, I feel it. And then if you stimulated here, it would take a delay to get to the brain. What he found was pretty much the opposite, actually. If you stimulate here, it takes 30 milliseconds, and you get a spike, what's called an evoked potential. If you stimulate here, it took 500 milliseconds, a half a second, which is a long time in the brain. And then he did some other experiments with the thalamus, which showed that if he got the evoked potential and got the ongoing activity, but only for, say, 100 milliseconds, there was no consciousness at 30 milliseconds. He concluded that somehow there needed to be this evoked potential, and then 500 milliseconds, or at least several hundred milliseconds of ongoing activity afterwards to have the experience at the 30 milliseconds. In other words, somehow the brain knew what was going to happen in the future. And he suggested that there was this backward referral of subjective information going from roughly 500 milliseconds back to the time of the
stimulus,
of the evoked potential caused by the stimulus. And this is very important because it allows the possibility of free will. For example, if you and I are talking and I say something and you respond quickly back to me, the activity in your brain that correlates with what I said occurs after you've already responded. So the consensus in neuroscience and what they concluded was that you would respond, or we respond generally non-consciously, and have an illusion of consciousness being in control after the fact. Rendering consciousness epiphenomenal. And as Huxley said, we're merely helpless spectators. Now, with backward time, you get around that problem. So it allows you to act consciously in real time, and actually can explain a lot. And this kind of backward time effect has been popping up in neuroscience, parapsychology, quantum physics for many, many years.